Welcome to Chapter 13, Key Issue 3, your second to last video for the year. Today we're talking about cities still, and why cities are growing, why are they expanding, urban sprawl, why is that, happening. Okay, so first up, these are the 10 fastest growing cities. And you will notice, you need to write these all down, but what I would do is notice where they're located, okay? So we have Bangladesh, Tanzania, Nigeria, India, Mali, Afghanistan, India, Yemen, India, China, okay? So for the most part, all semi-periphery or periphery countries, okay? So think back to chapter 2. Why might that be? Well, because their CBR is really high, right? That has a lot to do with it. What's Bangladesh really known for? Textile industry, so they have a lot of employment opportunities there. But yeah, none of these are on the core country list because we have more controlled growth, okay? I would say more controlled. That doesn't mean that we don't have cities that are rapidly growing, but just not at the rate that these cities are. Okay. So, there's been a lot of rural to urban migration, starting with really the Industrial Revolution and the Second Agricultural Revolution. Once we introduced machines, didn't need as many farmers. Where did those people go who didn't farm anymore? They went into cities to work at factories, right? So most urban growth can attribute to this transition from rural to urban migration. Where have most of these people come from in urban areas? From rural areas, okay? So this is definitely true in LDCs. In MDCs, countries are nearly entirely urbanized. So rural to urban migration isn't as big of a factor. It's almost like we had that happen in MDCs in the 19th century, and we're kind of past that. Now we just have a lot of people who live in cities. But LDCs are kind of still in that transition because they're going through their industrialization right now. Okay? So why do people move from rural to urban areas? Mostly economic opportunities and better life for your family or for that individual. Okay? What are the effects of having all of this movement? Squatter settlements are the big ones. So squatter settlements, we've talked about them before. I don't know if I've defined them for you so much. It's an area within a city in a less developed country in which people illegally establish residencies on land they do not own or rent and erect homemade structures. Okay? Sometimes you might hear these be called shanty towns, and that's also appropriate. But basically, it's makeshift housing. This happens because as urban areas become more popular, land within that urban area and housing within that urban area gets really, really expensive. So people either cannot afford to purchase something, or what also happens is there could be a lack of housing altogether. So there's nowhere else for these people to go than build their own structure. Quite sad. And these are, you won't find squatter settlements in MDCs. These are periphery and semi-periphery city phenomenon. It's not something that occurs typically in a core country. Okay? All right. So why does urbanization happen? I talked about how improved agriculture meant we didn't need as many hands on farms to help. Better methods of transportation, especially the invention of the car, meant that you did not have to live within walking distance of somewhere that you worked, right? But before that, there were trolleys and railways and things like that that existed that made it possible for people to commute. Economic opportunities are more abundant in urban areas. There are more jobs available in urban areas than rural areas. It's difficult to find a job especially in an isolated rural area if you're not in agriculture. And government policies made cities more attractive. Think about this, like the first places to get working internet were these big cities. The first places to establish indoor plumbing were cities. So governments set up systems in these cities typically first And a lot of times rural areas don't get the same amount of services. Okay? They're also a lot better organized governmentally than rural areas. Okay, so transportation is a big part of this. This is part of the reason cities are expanding. So when we talk about transportation, you could talk about cars, buses, trains, subways. These are kind of modern modes of transportation today. You always want to be specific. Same with the word technology. On your FRQs, we tend to say technology. But technology has lots of different things. Like, what do you mean by technology, right? Just putting little screws on my glasses to make the arms move like this is technology. But then also, so is a computer. So it's, do you see, it's like really wide. And then transportation as well. You should always specify what kind of transportation you're talking about. Okay? So the landscapes of these cities change as transportation and infrastructure changes. As we got more cars on the road, more highway systems built, it allowed Americans and also, I would say, residents in other core countries to move further and further out to the suburbs, okay? And we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Right now, this is something that is not in your book that needs to go in your notes. It is very important. I know there's at least one test question about this. It is in the list of things you absolutely have to know for the test, okay? So this is, I don't know exactly how, Bourchier, I think is how you pronounce it, Bourchier's model. So he basically is just laying out the different eras of transportation, okay? So the first one is the sail and wagon epoch. That's 1790 to 1830. Then we move to the iron horse, okay? Steam-powered engines is what we're talking about, not like literal, horses made out of iron. That would be weird. Steel rails, okay? So a national rail system connecting the west to the east. Auto air amenities, so these are like diesel engines, cars, 1920s to 1970s, and then satellite electronic jet propulsion. Obviously, this is not, so it says it's not a formal stage of Bourchier, and that's because people are not getting to work using jet propulsion, right? Typically. But it is a new mode of transportation. It's like a new era of transportation. But, so basically, you just need to know kind of how transportation has progressed. What are the different stages transportation has gone through? Okay. Something new is rapid transit, which is popular in large cities. It has allowed inhabitants of a city to move further away from the CBD, sometimes even further than a suburban area. Sometimes what ends up happening is, I was in Phoenix just this last weekend, and Phoenix is a huge city, but what has happened is they have made these nodes outside of the city that also have residences. So you can commute to work when you don't even live in the same city. Like lots of people who work in Washington, D.C. live in Baltimore because they use rapid transit to get to work, so it doesn't take too long. It's actually quicker than driving a car because traffic is so bad in some of these cities. So, for the most part, this has led to a sharp decline in mass transit, so trains and buses, like traditional trains we're talking about. And rapid transit in major cities is also on the rise. So what we're talking about here is the New York City subway, Metro in DC, BART in the Bay Area, things that use these types of maps, okay? So I'll actually show you here. So this is the Washington, D.C. Metro. I lived there for a summer, so I'm pretty familiar with it. What am I looking for here? This is out in Virginia, like Springfield, Virginia, Alexandria. So this is outside of the city. It's not even in the city, but it goes all the way out there. Branch Avenue, this is out in Maryland. All the Green Line stuff is out in Maryland. So like a lot of these things are outside of the city, but the rapid transit has connected all of the outskirts to the inside, if that makes sense. Okay. So more on transportation and suburbanization. So as transportation improved, people moved out to the suburbs. We've talked about this before, I think, in the migration chapter, but especially after World War II, this started happening because people were buying their own cars. They had highway systems that could help them get to work. With those cars, fuel was cheap, definitely cheaper than today. And then there were set hours. So this is like mostly in the industrial area, but weekends, right? Having a 9-to-5 job meant that you had like clear times with which you could commute. And then people were having a lot of babies, right? Remember the baby boom? We see a spike in CBR following World War II. Where are you going to put all those kids? You're going to need to buy a house, right? Somewhere. All right, 95% of transportation within the U.S. is by personal motor car. That is still true. So that makes us a little bit unique. Sometimes our big cities don't have less motor traffic per capita probably than our smaller cities, but it's still mostly how Americans get places is by car. The peripheral model, sometimes called the galactic city model, I'm not sure why, probably because it looks kind of like a galaxy. I'll show you in a second. Was developed by Chauncey Harris. So there's an inner city surrounded by large suburban residential and business areas. So what we talked about today was the multiple nuclei model, and basically the galactic city model takes it a step further. And what you get are these edge cities. So when I was talking about Phoenix, Tempe, Scottsdale, those two cities would be considered edge cities. So they're cities that kind of developed on the outskirts of these larger cities. So that's what the suburbs looked like in the 1950s. So more on the peripheral model, urban area consists of an inner city surrounded by a large suburban residential and business area and tied together by some sort of transportation route. So either a beltway or a ring road or something like that. So some major, not always have to be a highway, but some major roadway that allows for commuters. Specialized zones or nodes exist, so you might have like a cluster of hotels, a cluster of restaurants, things like that. It looks like this. This is in your book. We will, of course, do a map journal on this as well. But what we're looking at, so like this is a node, this is the airport, so this ends up being like an edge city. The shopping mall would be an edge city. This location of offices would be an edge city. You get like all these other little nodes. Okay? So basically, I just showed you what these were. But an edge city is a large node or office, retail activities on the edge of an urban area. Oftentimes these start out as residential areas, and eventually they kind of turn into more industrialized, and then like service industry centered. So shopping malls, sometimes smaller manufacturing, sometimes specialized industries like theme parks, airports, things like that. All right. Okay. Well, that's it then. We have one more to go, you guys. It's getting so close. As of tomorrow, our test is exactly 1 month away. Oh my God. All right. Be ready for a pop quiz.